Hey guys, Matt Cobb here with another daily devotion for you. Continuing on in the book of James, and last week we talked about favoritism is anti-gospel. I kind of called that part one, and we're going to pick up in the second part of this section where he's talking about that when we show favoritism towards people, it is contrary to the message of the gospel that Jesus loved the whole world. God loved everybody, and that's why Jesus came for each and every one of us. So we're going to read today's passage, and then we're going to dive into things just a little bit. So this is starting in James chapter 2 in verse 8. It says, "If indeed you keep the royal law prescribed in the scripture, love your neighbor as yourself, you are doing well. But if you show favoritism, you commit sin and are convicted by the law as transgressors. For whoever keeps the entire law yet fails in one point is guilty of breaking it all. For he who said, 'Do not commit adultery,' also said, 'Do not murder.' So if you do not commit adultery, but you do murder, you are a lawbreaker. Speak and act as those who will be judged by the law of freedom. For judgment is without mercy to the one who hasn't shown mercy. Mercy triumphs over judgment." So James has just kind of recapped, and he's kind of piggybacking off of what he was just saying, that he used the example of rich versus poor and showing favoritism to somebody who is wealthy and looks nice, but treating somebody who is poor and looks disheveled as a lesser quality person. But we can be just as guilty of showing favoritism when it comes to aspects of age, young versus old, and showing favoritism to an old person or showing favoritism to a young person. It can be both ways. It can also be in regards to race, people who look different from us just because of their skin color. It can also be somebody that has influence or position and power, that we show favoritism to them, but somebody who doesn't have any kind of connections that we dismiss. It can be favoritism when it comes to gender. And it can also be favoritism when it comes to aspect of family background. And I've witnessed myself that people who have a family history, that they're treated differently just because of who their parent is or their grandparent is or other things like that. And so what James then goes on to do is he just flat out bluntly calls it as it is, that favoritism is sin. Pure and simple. Favoritism is sin. When you favor one person over another, you are sinning. And he goes so far as to show it then the command of love your neighbor as yourself. Jesus talked about that as the second greatest commandment. The first being to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And the second is like it, love your neighbor as yourself. And James is piggybacking off of this. It says, if you don't love your neighbor as you love yourself and are showing favoritism, you're breaking that law. And then he just goes on to kind of hammer that nail home a little bit further and says that, if you're guilty of breaking one aspect of the entire law, you're guilty of breaking all of it. So in reality, who of us are not guilty then of breaking all of the law? Romans 3:23 says that all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. So, we're all guilty. But then he goes on to talk about being people that are merciful and forgiving. And this made me think of a lot, kind of parallel to what Jesus shared when his disciples came. This is in Matthew 18. His disciples came to him. Peter even asked him, he says, so, when somebody has wronged me, how often am I supposed to forgive them? Up to 7 times. That was kind of the Jewish custom, that you could forgive a person 7 times and then afterwards you did not have to forgive them. But Jesus kind of adds an extra layer and goes that much further and says, not just 7, but 70 times 7. And he wasn't trying to say an exact, 490 times, but he's using hyperbole, the gross exaggeration, saying we need to be generous, lavish people when it comes to mercy and forgiveness. And then I think he goes on to illustrate that point in the next parable when he goes and tells the story about a man who owed a king 10,000 talents. and that man could not repay the debt. And just to give you some perspective and context, 10,000 talents would have been the equivalent of 200,000 years of wages. So the man owed him 200,000 years of working wages in money. So not even that you would keep any of that money to live off of. If you worked 200,000 years, all of the money that you earned, he had to owe back to this king. So clearly a debt that could not be repaid. And so the master, the king, forgives this servant. So, I mean, imagine the relief and the joy that this servant experienced. And to give you an equivalent, that might be the equivalent of like $3.5 billion. Those are with a B, $1 billion. So clearly, this was a debt that could not ever be repaid. And then another servant who was in debt to the first servant came up and said, I owe you 100 denarii. A denarii was 1 day's wage. So 100 days of working to pay back a debt. Something that could be repaid, but this servant says, I can't repay you. The one who had just been forgiven 10,000 talents, $3.5 billion, says, no, you owe me every last bit. Jesus is saying we need to be lavish people just as we have been forgiven, because the debt of sin that we owed, being guilty of the entire law, we could never repay that. And so we need to be lavish in forgiving. Just as Jesus forgave us, we need to be lavish in forgiving and extending mercy to people. And I love how James caps out this section with this declarative statement that mercy triumphs over judgment. You know, and it's true. We owed a debt, but God was merciful, and mercy will always triumph over judgment. So my encouragement to you guys this week is be people of mercy and forgiveness, because mercy will always triumph. Have a great week, guys. Talk to you later.